Ladies and gents, welcome back. Today, my guest is the author of the book Unanswered Questions and is working on a new book about, well, we'll get into just that, but I'm really interested in this article that he wrote for Covert Action magazine, and this is about the Coutts Four, the political prisoners over there in Coutts, Alberta. Ray McGinnis, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to speak with you, Clyde. Good to be on your show.
Oh, thank you. And I'm really excited to have you because there's not many people out there that have information on this story. And there's not a lot of publications. I don't know if they're not willing to talk about it or if they're just being quiet for whatever political reasons. But can you walk me through this? What's with the silence, and why are you one of the only people covering this?
So yeah, I'm one of the only people covering this. I guess because it was suggested to me. I've published once previously with Covert Action magazine an article about the convoy and about the Public Order Emergency Commission. And
well, I understand that's what your upcoming book is going to be about, correct?
Yeah, well, my upcoming book, Unjustified, the working title, and so when that article came out in late February, I ended up on a half a dozen podcasts in the U.S., Canada, and Europe, and one of them was with Trish Wood, the former CBC award-winning broadcaster with the Fifth Estate, and As It Happens, and then she's been a documentarian for 20 years, and then the pandemic hit, and then she's been covering the pandemic, and she had me on her show. And as it happens, I ended up being at an event in Hamilton in mid-June, and she was there as well. And so we had a visit, and she said, I liked your article on the commission, and I think you should write something about the Coutts Four. And I thought, well, nice suggestion. I'll see what I can do. And when I began to write, there was not an awful lot to find online. There was really, it was kind of like there was all the media stories initially about the arrests in mid-February of 2022 of the four guys charged with conspiracy to commit murder. And then after the hoopla around, the cache of weapons and who they were, a bit about Diagolon and so on. And then the story just seemed to just disappear. There was an article in the New York Times in September of 2022, a couple of things into early December of 2022, and then media silence. And so, and then what happened, fortunately for me, is there was to be a trial to start around the 12th of June this year. But right before that happened, there were 3,000 pages of documents dropped on the defense by the prosecution. Anyway, that it changed things around entirely from being a trial to being pre-trial motions. And there was a guy called Jason Levine in Alberta who had a podcast, and I was then able to follow some of the people who were close to the story and eventually ended up on his show a number of times. And so I was able to dig into it more. So it's been very interesting. And in answer to your question about the media silence and there is a publication ban, which is quite specific to some, an unsealed envelope and some redacted documents that nobody can see. But it's not a ban on talking about the story generally, or even specifically regarding some things coming out of the pretrial motions in June and then at the last week of July. But maybe out of an abundance of caution, or maybe for other reasons, a lot of the media are choosing not to cover the story at all. I'll mention one thing that happened. I've been on a show with Lieutenant Stephen Rogers, who's, I would say, kind of more libertarian leaning in New Jersey, and he has a show, and and he was having me on his show. I was on his show in July, and I mentioned that I had another article about the Coutts Four that happened earlier out of a website in Europe, and I mentioned I had this article, and he let me know that his people on his I don't know if there's a legal team or a legal advisor regarding his media outfit, but that the legal advice he received was that we cannot touch this story, so we're not going to talk with you about it. And so I thought it was interesting that an alternate news outlet out of New Jersey would be given legal advice not to touch this story. So
I'm really interested, and I'm sure like anyone who hasn't heard of this story now is pretty intrigued on what's the whole gist about it. Can you run us through like who are these Coutts Four, and why are they being held, and why have they been held for over 500 days now in jail? They're it's an unbelievable circumstance in Canadian history. We haven't heard of people being detained for such a lengthy period of time with I don't even know what the charges are.
Yeah. So the four individuals. There's a guy, a landscaper named Chris Carbert, and his high school or public school buddy, Chris Lysick, who's an electrician, and then two other men, Jerry Morin, who's a lineman, and a gravel truck owner, Anthony or Tony Oleanic. And they're the four of them. I mean, the two Chris's knew each other from public school, but the four of them had never met each other until they were all found themselves at the Coutts blockade during those 18 days. And I think Jerry Morin was there only very late in the day, as like some of them had been there throughout most of it, and I think Jerry Morin was there quite late, and suddenly caught up in all of this. The Coutts blockade began in sympathy with the Freedom Convoy protest that was beginning around the weekend of the 28th, 29th, 30th of January in Ottawa, and it popped up as a blockade protest together with the one in Emerson, Manitoba, and Surrey, British Columbia, and Windsor, Ontario, and Sarnia, I think, and maybe a few other places that were on and off. And so these four men, there was, let me mention one thing that happened early on in the Coutts blockade, which is just the first weekend of the end of January 2022. By the 1st of February, the Alberta Premier Jason Kenney had gone to the press, and he talked about how there was he'd been informed that there were protesters in Coutts who a protester had assaulted a police officer, and this was unacceptable. Understandably unacceptable for people to assault a police officer, and this was not to be tolerated, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I think that the takeaway for most people in Alberta, and maybe if the story was carried nationally, watching that would agree that citizens should not assault police officers. But later on, there was a story by Rebel News doing a documentary on the Coutts protests, and it included a phone call that was recorded to a Corporal Curtis Peters, I think, who was the spokesperson for the RCMP, and he was on the phone with this guy from Rebel News, Keon Simone, I think, and the corporal confirmed that in relationship to the incident that Premier Kenney was talking about, actually, it had to do with two citizens having an altercation, a minor car accident, and then maybe maybe a fist flew, but in any event, it was 2 citizens, and there was no RCMP, no police officer involved at all. And so the story, as it was reported, maybe the premier was misinformed, but in any event, there was no need to be upset about Coutts protesters assaulting a police officer because it never happened.
Right, it's inaccurate.
Yeah. So, but that sort of begins the narrative about how the protesters in Coutts are violent and unlawful, which parallels some of the stuff coming out of the depiction of the protesters in Ottawa.
And we're hearing about many other inaccuracies as we're going forward with this story. I heard one of the big prevalent things at the time was a manifesto that somehow came out from the Coutts Four, or from somebody claiming that they wanted to do awful things to an RCMP agent. Yet then that disappeared. And what happened there?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, like a manifesto, I don't know about any manifesto that they. I mean, there was a suggestion. There's a suggestion by the Anti-Hate Network about a group connected to Jeremy McKenzie regarding his creation of a fictional world called Diagolon, which would encompass 26 states in the United States and a number of the Western provinces. And Diagolon is to be headed up, or the vice president of Diagolon is a plasticine or plastic goat that time travels and is cocaine addicted. I mean, it's
a joke.
I mean, I mean, it's not. I mean, it shouldn't be a serious top priority. I mean, if I was talking to somebody at a bar saying, "Hey, I'm thinking of creating a whole new country and carving it out of half of the United States of America and portions of the western part of Canada," I mean, somebody might say, "I think, buddy, you've had too much to drink." But in any event, this was taken seriously by some government-funded media outlets. And
now, Jeremy McKenzie is a known comedian on the internet, correct?
Yeah, I mean, he's a former Afghan or Canadian Armed Forces veteran. He is very disenchanted with the disconnect between the country that he was serving on behalf of by going to Afghanistan, and what he's found especially under the Trudeau Liberal government. So I think from what my sense is from watching his testimony at the Public Order Emergency Commission was that he would be kind of making fun of, in a sarcastic, even mocking way, kind of making fun of the intelligence community, making fun of the government. But it seems that there would be responses to him that showed that you'd have different officers taking everything he was saying absolutely in absolute earnest. And the connection that ends up happening is that at one point there was one of the Chris's, I'm trying to remember which one, ends up being at a gathering, like a barbecue in Saskatchewan, where Jeremy McKenzie is, and so there's a suggestion that Chris Carbert and Chris Lysek have ties to Jeremy McKenzie, and that they're in Coutts trying to begin creating Diagolon. Now, it's just a narrative that goes out there in the media, but it's not, as far as I understand, it's not as though even the prosecution is, at least maybe they're planning on it, but from what I can tell, there's no one who's saying that the prosecution is charging any of the four with trying to manifest Diagolon's dream, if you could say. So it's like there's the charges, but they're not bringing up Diagolon. And interestingly, also, Jeremy McKenzie. I mean, he had his own charges of related to some incident in Saskatchewan. But he has not been charged with anything to do with the Coutts Four. So, it's there's an awful lot of inference and innuendo and hearsay talk, but when it gets down to what's there to see, there's nothing really solid except it's just suggestions of things that are maybe awful that don't end up seeming to be of much substance.
So the question then would be, what are they being held on? What are the crimes that they're being accused of, and how are they not out on bail? I mean, with the bail that we've seen in Canada, violent criminals are back out on the street within 24 hours. Why are these men being held for over 500 days now?
Yeah, 565 days, whatever it is now. Mm-hmm. So they were initially, all four of them were initially charged on mischief over $5,000, sort of what the search warrant indicated. And then later on, I think just prior to, within an hour before the Prime Minister invoked the Emergencies Act, then suddenly there are additional charges of conspiracy to commit murder. Now, those are the charges, and it's. I mean, there was a display of a photo taken by the RCMP of an RCMP cruiser in the background, and in the foreground, a cache of weapons, variously on the table, leaning against a table, and at the base of the table, with vests and a lot of long gun rifles for hunting deer or whatever, mm-hmm. bear spray, vests. There was one vest with a Diagolon patch, seemingly. But again, and talking with people, it's not clear where all of these weapons came from. It's not clear if any of these weapons in that cache are related to any of the four, or how they are. And as well, it should be noted that the weapons in question were not bagged properly, according to a former Toronto sergeant and police detective Donald Best, who's also been interested in this story recently. He said they haven't followed the protocols of what you need to do if you want to secure the evidence. If the cache of weapons in that famous photo now are evidence that's supposed to be used at a trial, you're supposed to properly bag each item. You're supposed to take DNA testing and fingerprinting. There was the suggestion by the RCMP in their public statements that there were other unknown people who were connected to the plot to shoot police officers that are still at large. Well, if that's the case, you need to be doing the proper security, securing the weapons so that it can be, legitimately entered in a trial. Contrast this with what happened with the shooter of multiple persons in Nova Scotia a number of years ago. It took months before the RCMP released any exhibits of weapons because they wanted to secure the evidence. Mm-hmm. So Donald Best knows better than I do what police procedures are, and he thinks that the display of the cache of weapons really is more a photo op for political, a political agenda.
Well, that would make a lot of sense, considering
Yeah.
the chain of custody is a very important role in crime fighting if they want to have any of that evidence actually used in a case. Now, are these men, do they have a case? Is there, what is going on, and why are they not being released? There's no parole, there's no there's no bail for these individuals, and what is the reason given why?
Well, I understand that one of the four had a lawyer, because they all have, each of the four have, they're not being represented by one law firm or one lawyer. They all have their own individual lawyers. Some have legal aid, and others are retaining a lawyer. So one of the lawyers made an application for bail for their client. And my understanding is that the judge in question wouldn't even look at the documentation presented by the lawyer, and just sort of waved it away and said, no, it's kind of like, this person's guilty, and so I'm not gonna really even discuss this with you. So normally, of course, as you mentioned, we've got people like, there's one person who's up on a murder charge of a police officer in Toronto, and yet that person goes out on bail, within days. There's numbers of people who've been accused of murder, and second-degree murder, who are going out on bail, all the time in Canada when this happens. And yet, I mean, the whole tradition, even preceding our country, going back to, I found a pre-Magna Carta back to 1166 with the sees or assize of Clarendon under Henry II in England, set the precedent back in 1166 that if someone is accused of a crime, that they have a right to see their accusers in court and defend themselves. And so it's been in the interests of Western justice ever since 1166 that people who are accused of a crime have a chance to defend themselves and are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Mm-hmm. Now, if you don't do that, if you create a kind of pre-Magna Carta, pre-Henry II justice system, you can simply accuse people of crimes, serious crimes, and just leave them in jail for as long as you please. Maybe you can hope that they'll plead, that they'll have a plea deal, and they'll see the desperate straits that they're in, and say, okay, well, I'll plead guilty if you give me less of a sentence or something. Now, these four have maintained, even through all these 565 days or whatever it is now, that they are innocent. Mm-hmm. So it's and also, one of them has been, I think Chris Carbert's been leading Bible study. I think maybe Jerry Morin's been leading yoga classes for inmates. I mean, they're doing things that, well, aren't what you might expect, given the kind of, if they're supposed to be insurrectionists and so on. One guard said to one of the four accused, this is weird. We thought you were white supremacists, but they clearly weren't behaving in any concerning ways in terms of their interactions with other persons of color, in the lining up for meals and so on. So the guards, numbers of the guards began to realize these guys aren't like unhinged zealots that they're supposed to be portrayed as.
So what can be done about this situation? Obviously, they're being held indefinitely is the only word I can think of. What can they do? What legal recourse do they have? And is there a date set for any hearings? What's happening?
So since I wrote my article, there has been a development. Because the defense for the four have collaboratively made a criminal code 1 application to the judge, which has to do, as I understand it, with concerns. Well, there was something called inadvertent disclosure in the 3,000 pages of documents that were dropped on the defense in mid-June. Some of what was given to them was disclosed accidentally. The Crown didn't intend to let the defense see certain pages, and certain pages were not redacted, and they revealed certain things that has led the defense to have this criminal code 1 application, raising concerns about the conduct of the Crown in this case related to what would be called gross misconduct and also crime fraud. Now, I haven't gone off and looked up what do you need to be doing as a Crown prosecutor in order to be guilty of crime fraud. But in any event, it's apparently quite serious. And there is a sealed envelope that reveals some of what's been concerning the defense to lead them to make this criminal code 1 application. And the Crown was objecting to the judge looking at that sealed document, that sealed envelope, but the judge has decided that they will look at the envelope. Now, in the life of the legal system, there are schedules. All 4 lawyers have to get their schedules to line up for a free date, together with the 3, I think, Crown prosecutors, together with the judge, who was also, the judge was going away on a holiday. So sometime in September, I anticipate, there will be a day in the Lethbridge courthouse where the judge, together with the defense and the Crown, the judge will look at unseal the envelope, look at what the contents say, and then make some decisions about what the implications are for this case, which has not gone to trial. And at this point, I don't think that there's a trial date yet, but it would be, if the trial date, there's been talk about a date set perhaps in late May, early June of 2024.
So,
however,
they could be sitting in jail that entire time until then.
Yes. However, if the contents of the sealed envelope are stunning enough and reveal criminal code violations by the Crown in their conduct, and I can't guess at what that would be, but if that's the case, there may be a number of different directions in which this whole matter goes. One might be that the whole thing is tossed. I don't think that the 4 accused necessarily, I don't think that they want that to happen, because I think they want to have, now that the media has described them as, in some cases as monsters and unhinged zealots and so on, I think that they would like to have a day in court so that they can clear their names. Otherwise, there could be headline news stories about how the case is not going to continue because of a legal technicality or something in terms of gross misconduct, but isn't it too bad because these guys are really guilty according to Global or CBC or CTV, so that the 4 could carry on. They could be not having a trial, they could be released, but they would yet have a court of public opinion through the lens of certain media commentators still judge them as guilty, even though they never were convicted. So, but anyway, that might not happen. They may end up, something else might happen, like they may end up being given, they may be released on bail based on whatever the contents of that sealed envelope reveal. There's a number of things that can go, and I'm not a lawyer, or I'm not, so I don't know all of what the possible directions are. But clearly, this is a development which is, I think, welcome news for the defense. I mean, unless the Crown decides that they want to appeal the decision of the judge to open the sealed envelope all the way to the Supreme Court, which I don't think they're going to do.
Well, let's hope they don't, because that just means more time for these four in prison, and that's what it is. From what I hear, most of the time served was in solitary. So these guys, from what I get too, is when you spend time in solitary, it's actually counted as double time. So if it's 500 something days, we're well into 1,000 plus days of time served, even if they found they were guilty of some misdemeanor, which was the original charges. We understand now at this point. Unbelievable case, unbelievable, and thank you so much, Ray, for taking the time to dive into this case, because there's not many journalists out there that are willing to put this time into it. Also, where can people find your other works? I understand you have a book coming up. You have another book that's been published as well.
Yeah, I have a couple of books that have been published. My first book, way back in 2005, was a book called Writing Was Sacred, a psalm-inspired path for writing and appreciating sacred poetry, which invites people to look at the biblical book of Psalms and write their own new psalms or spiritual poems from whatever tradition they may find themselves in.
Interesting.
So there's that. And then in 2021, I published Unanswered Questions, What the September 11th Families Asked and the 9/11 Commission Ignored, which chronicles the story of how the Family Steering Committee for the 9/11 Commission, made up of a dozen family members that lost loved ones on 9/11, went to Washington, D.C. and forced a reluctant Bush administration to have an investigation, how they monitored the 9/11 Commission, and what the fallout is from that experience. So so that book is on Amazon on ebook or paperback, or get the book through your own local bookstore as you wish. So, and now here I am writing about another commission. So, maybe one day I'll write a book about the Titanic Commission.
Yeah, for sure. I'm looking forward to this new book coming out. What's the title, the working title of it?
The working title is called Unjustified.
Unjustified. Well, that's what many of us would disagree with Paul Rouleau and his decision at the Public Order Emergency Commission. Ray McGinnis, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be with you, Clyde. Thanks so much for having me.